Okay, we are live on Zoom, live on Facebook, and we are ready to start. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. I am Ashley Jones, the Managing Director of Community Programs here at the Venture Center. And today we've got a great topic for you in a workshop about rethinking office space during COVID. This is a very timely workshop as some businesses have brought their employees back into the office. Some are continuing to work from home, and others have a mix of the two setups. Today's speakers, Bennett Dunkley and Matt Trebner, are with HLW, an award-winning architecture, design, and planning firm based in New York. Bennett Dunkley, principal at HLW, works with higher ed institutions to envision the campus of the future, as well as large financial organizations in their workplace transformations. Bennett leads his clients in all phases of the design process, all the way through the first day of business, and he is a registered architect. We also have Matt Trebner, Director of Strategy at HLW, whose work focuses on pre-design strategy and engagement with end users, from workshops and surveys to master planning and change management. Matt is also a lecturer at Yale University on the future of cities. Today, they're going to be discussing how different organizations across sectors are planning for a return to the office from physical distancing, touchless technology, and sophisticated HVAC systems. Additionally, they'll be discussing the long-term impact to the workplace and what it means to build remote equity with teams split between working from home and in the office. For today's workshop, we want it to be interactive. I hear there's going to be some polling and some questions. So feel free, if you have a question, drop it in the chat box, whether it's on Zoom or you're watching us from Facebook Live. We'll get those answered for you. And I'm sure later on we'll save some room for questions as well. But first, a big thank you to our sponsors, Wright Lindsay Jennings, a local law firm here in Little Rock, Frost, which is a local CPA firm here in Little Rock, as well as the Little Rock Regional Chamber, for all of their continued support of our programs that we put on every month and throughout the year. So thank you to them. And now I'll go ahead and turn it over to Bennett and Matt.
Thank you, Ashley. A big thank you to the Venture Center for having us. I'm Matt Trebner, the Director of Strategy at HLW. Before we jump into today, we did just want to go through a quick agenda so you have a sense of what's coming up over the next 40 minutes or so. So we'll start off with some introductions to talk a little bit about Bennett and I, where we come from, what we've been doing with clients these days. And then we want to do a quick pulse check. So we'll be doing some virtual polling to get a sense of where everyone out there is with regard to return to work from home, all of those fun things. We'll talk quickly about HLW, the firm, and what we've been doing with our clients. And then we're going to launch into the meat of the conversation, which is really focused on COVID and the workplace and what it means. So we'll be talking about return to office and how we've been helping clients in that regards, and also what we're seeing people thinking about for the future. So looking beyond the pandemic, what is the next 10 years of the workplace going to look like? Bennett is a sort of thought leader in higher ed, so we do want to spend a little bit of time on what we're seeing in that space. And then finally, we want to provide some tips and tricks for folks who are interested in, how you make a better work from home setup, whether it's through different policies, protocols, etiquette, or just, reconfiguring your home workplace. You please ask questions. We'll save some space at the end of this for a deeper Q&A, but we're happy to answer things throughout as well. So Bennett, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Mimi. Thank you, the Venture Center, for having us today. This is terrific. As Ashley said, I'm an architect. I'm a principal with HLW. My background and focus has been on architecture throughout my career of various types. So I've designed and built lab buildings, educational buildings, office buildings, residential, hospitality. So I have a kind of a diverse background, but it's all really the same thing, right? Like, this is all about places for people to learn, places for people to work, live. And there are parallels in all of those different kind of paths that people take and those places that people need. And so one thing that we will try and do throughout this this time today is to make some of those parallels. As Matt said, you know, I will touch on some higher ed stuff later on. A lot about what we're learning now as the landscape and the environment is changing for us, it pertains equally in educational environments as it does in workplace environments, and some of those parallels, you know, learn from one another, which is pretty interesting. Okay, Matt.
Sorry about that. You're a little quiet, but so maybe you may have to shout. So
I'll get closer. I was trying to keep my head at a normal size, but
okay.
it's bigger now.
Okay, so as Ashley was mentioning earlier on, I'm Matt Trebner. I am the director of workplace strategy at HLW. That might be something that's new for a lot of folks. So workplace strategy is really before you start thinking about what the design of the space should be, before you start, you know, getting architects and designers to build your space, we work with clients to actually figure out what the requirements are. So we do that in a few different ways. Through either quantitative data gathering, which could be through utilization or surveys, things like that, benchmarking. So where do you stand versus your competitors or your peers? But then we also do it in a really qualitative way. So we'll do workshops and visioning sessions, interviews with the actual end users. And the goal here is really to make sure that we're gathering the right type of data so that the design is really aligned to both the mission and the needs of organizations that we're working with. So I've had the privilege of working with HLW for about 6 years now, and working with clients kind of all over the place. You know, a lot of our work is done in New York, but all over the US, in fact, as well as Europe and the Middle East. We kind of work across sectors. There's no sort of one size fits all for us. So we'll be showing you some work from, you know, tech leaders like Google, but also, you know, insurance companies and things like that. So it's a little bit all over the place, which is why I love it. So before we get into the bulk of the presentation, as I mentioned, we want to do a little bit of live polling. So bear with me for a second while I bring up our live polling stuff. And I believe that I can just, one second, just drop this into the chat. So what I'm doing is I'm going to drop this link into the chat. So you guys should be able to see that in a moment. And once you see it, we will be able to start doing a little bit of live polling. And this is not meant to be, you know, a lot of work. We don't want to put you to work yet. So what we want to do though is ask you some questions just so that we can kind of tailor the presentation to your needs. So hopefully everyone can see that link in the Zoom chat. And if not, I also have it up on the screen there. Is everyone able to see my screen still?
Yes.
Great. All right, so we'll start the polling, and we want to talk a little bit about what your work from home situation is like, and probably most importantly, what you're wearing. Obviously, this stuff has changed very quickly, so I see that someone has already chimed in on what they're wearing. So some people are still dressed to impress, suits every day. In my case, I'm professional up top, party down below. So I don't tend to wear fancy pants anymore. Sweats is another big one. And then a lot of people we meet with are keeping cameras off, just going super low key. So it sounds like this is a group that is primarily in the sweats category, which is interesting. We'll give you a few more seconds, see if there's anyone who actually is dressed to impress every day these days. There are one or two lucky people, maybe not lucky, but one or two people who are still trying to keep it together and be professional. So kudos to you. That is awesome. I wish I had that sort of discipline. So we're gonna pop over to the next question. When working from home, I'm typically sitting pretty in my home office, hunched over the kitchen table, or in my case, a table that I've set up in my bedroom, or in bed. My laptop works fine in here. So no one is working from bed, which I think that's really good. Oh,
After 5 months, I'm not sure anyone would have any posture left if they were all working in bed.
yeah, I'm assuming that, you know, our offices are kind of all over the place. But for the folks who are in New York, especially if you're younger and have, you know, 4 or 5 roommates, there's a lot of kids who are actually forced to take calls in bed, which is probably not ideal. The next one, at home, I'm currently flying solo with few distractions, dealing with a pooch or another pet that needs my attention, or trying to keep my kids off camera. Ah, some dog lovers here, or pet lovers. There's someone on our team who has a parrot, which is a really interesting thing to have on video conferences because they are very, very noisy and they tend to want to shout right as you're about to present. Going forward, this is getting into a little bit more about the types of organizations that you work with. So how would you describe the current organization you typically work in? A small company with less than 10, 10 to 50, 50 to 200, 200 plus, party of one, I'm a solo practitioner, or maybe a student. Okay, so this is interesting. A pretty good split across all of these, although it looks like there's quite a few from large organizations, which is great. No students on the call, which is, Bennett, you're gonna have to get people really excited about higher ed.
Everybody's excited about higher ed. Is my sound better now, by the way?
Yeah, it's still kind of garbled. Okay, finally, next one. When do you anticipate returning to the office or school? Already back, sometime in the fall, likely early 2021, no clue. The situation is pretty fluid. Lots of people back and lots of people with no clue. This is something that we'll talk about a little bit later. We've been working on a lot of return to office projects, and I have to say it is all over the map in terms of what our clients are doing. There are some who didn't pause at all. They just kept going, which if you can, that's really great. But most people have sort of pushed everything to 2021, which is we'll get into in a second. And finally, the last question, what do you miss most about your workplace? The social interactions with your colleagues, the impromptu conversations where you can, you know, gather information, things like that, or just having good technology, or maybe just having a good ergonomic setup. That's, I think, probably what I miss the most. It is the social interactions. And that is not surprising. We've done quite a few surveys with clients, and above all, the social interactions is typically what people are really dying for. So that is it for some really quick impromptu polling, and I'll get back into the presentation now. So Bennett, do you want to take it away with a little bit of information about HLW?
I do, and I've got to apologize that I'm asking about my sound again, but is that better?
Way better.
Okay. All right. So thank goodness for technology. HLW at a glance. We're between 200 and 300 people right now. We're operating globally, headquartered in New York, which is the office that Matt and I live out of. Also with offices in New Jersey, Stamford, Connecticut, Los Angeles, and London. You know, we're touching a lot of the world. We're touching certainly a lot of the United States right now with projects kind of all over Texas, Illinois, Chicago, Florida, up and down East Coast and West Coast, and in between. We're providing most design services, so not just architectural and interiors, but we have in-house lighting, landscape, sustainability is all in-house. And then Matt is running our strategy group, which is a fascinating group of, I call them programmers on steroids. These are the folks that ask all of the right questions and do incredible listening in order to analyze what it is our clients are looking for, because a lot can get lost in the translation of not quite asking the right questions. So they're very dialed in question askers. we're a research-based organization. Some of the stuff we'll be making reference to throughout this presentation is research that we do. What's the point in trying to hypothesize what students of tomorrow might want or need, or what the office workers of tomorrow might want or need, if we don't take the time to do some research on their thoughts? And it's not necessarily always just client-driven research. It can be community-driven research. That's obviously a leader in how we understand what's coming next. And that's most important, particularly in a situation like the one that we're dealing now with COVID. We need to understand what's gonna happen next. We're dealing with a lot of noise in this situation. There's a lot of change happening hour by hour, minute by minute. We're all looking at the news and wondering, my goodness, what is the next move? We're trying to keep eyes very, very carefully trained on the future. What will be this quote unquote new normal? What are we going to experience now that's going to affect where we're going? So our research component becomes critical in all of that, as does the strategy side of things. You can see a pie chart there that's kind of showing you the split of the realms that we're working in by sector. You see a pretty heavy portion of that. More than a quarter is in technology. Tech is a sector that kind of tells us a lot about what's going to happen next, and I'll get into that in a slide or two. Go ahead, Matt. Okay, so again, these are the service sets that we just talked through, so we don't really need to stay here for very long. This is Google. This represents some of the work that we're doing in the tech sector. We're doing projects actively with Google for more than a decade, and with a number of other established tech organizations, Amazon, Audible, YouTube, and most of these are global accounts that we're working with around the world. I think what's the important message for this is, there's experimentation going on. There always has been in tech. We are kind of riding that fine line between what's acceptable in the workplace and what's not. But what we witness is that a lot of this work becomes the norm within a lot of other sectors. So, we start out looking at, really highly amenity rich places, which seems unusual, and the spread of those spaces looks very, very heavy. But then it becomes a newer normal, a newer version of what's the right thing to do, because we realize that people actually work in these spaces. So what we're looking at here is physically a corridor, and there's a few corridors in this presentation. And I love the notion that these spaces between spaces, corridors, we used to just call them that, right, are now places where people can interact and engage and do some of their most interesting thinking, believe it or not. Fordham University, I do represent our higher education and our education practice as sector lead globally. This is for Fordham. Fordham is a New York City school. For those of you that may not be familiar, they have campuses in the Bronx and in Manhattan as well. This is a building of great importance to the Bronx campus. This is their student center. So the center of life, the center of being a co-ed, the center of the university experience. And how academia, pedagogy, and athletics all merge in one place. So this becomes a central moment on the campus of super importance and relevance, and one of super importance and relevance in the crisis that we're dealing with now, in terms of the places that are really important for the cultural experience of an education. And the cultural experience of education and the cultural social experience of working, become very, very intertwined and become super important after we've all just spent the better part of 5 months away from one another. How are we going to deal with this going forward? Matt will get into some of that as we go on. Residential projects. I'll be very careful what I say here, because my managing director is on the line listening. and he runs our residential sector. This is an interesting project in Jersey City, which is right across the river. We're looking across the Hudson River from Manhattan into Jersey City. Irby is of the times residential product. It is a rental product. It is an amenity-rich building with apartments that are scaled down from the traditional size of apartments. That's really important as we start to think about what we're seeing again in the workplace on the amenity side and how we use the other spaces. Same on the higher ed side, same pattern on the residential side. These are buildings where people can virtually live and work and be in their community without leaving as frequently as they might have needed to in the past. So some of these buildings are going to start to show us, I think, what the ingredients might be looking forward into the future for more and more mixed use development on various scales, whether they're building scales or whether they're community scales. Deutsch is a project that our Los Angeles office did. It's in West LA. Deutsch is the client, Steelhead is the brand. Steelhead, this is a really cool space because it was designed as an advertising agency, but it was designed as a maker space. Everything about this space can function as a backdrop for filming. So they can actually do pre-production, production type work within this space. So you'll actually see commercials that are using the space as the, as the lab for actually making film. So pretty interesting notion. Again, this all kind of comes back around to mixed use. Everything can do more than one thing, right? The days of traditionally doing a space that's just your office and then having production studio around the corner might be changing. We might be seeing more efficient ways of using property. And then the last project here, this also I think is very relevant and of the times. This is also out of our Los Angeles office. It's also in West LA actually. This was a Macy's department store. What are we going to be doing with big box next, right? We've got big boxes empty all over the country right now. They're large space. What do we do with that large space? This is a developer organized project, 230,000 square feet, a Macy's, 3-story Macy's, probably not unlike most Macy's around the country, is being adaptively reused to create creative office and retail, all under the same roof, or in this case, because it's LA and it's beautiful, they carved a courtyard out of it, so there's not a roof over the whole thing. But you get my point. Again, this is mixed use. This is space where people can occupy to work and to shop. So doing more than one thing in the same, within the same footprint is increasingly more important and increasingly part of what the future looks like. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Bennett. I wanted to add one thing to that. We're showing, Bennett just went through like a lot of really, really big clients, a lot of really large scale work. We also do really, really small stuff. And that's not to say that that we don't like doing small stuff, but we do, projects that are less than 10,000 square feet. And they're just as fun, they're just as interesting, but we also work on the projects that are 1 million square feet. So it's kind of all over the map for us at the moment. So I wanted to talk a little bit about return to the office, what that means for our clients, what that means maybe for you, and then afterwards we'll talk a little bit about what it means for the long-term workplace. So we did a survey recently to talk to our clients about when they were anticipating coming back, and it was divided roughly into 5 groups. The first group A, those are the folks who were kind of unimpeded by the pandemic. They were able to keep going based on their location, based on the type of work that they were doing. Not a huge group, but they were the ones who kept going. The group B, again, kind of contingent on location. We had a lot of clients in the Midwest who were able to keep going, or sorry, not keep going, but return relatively soon. So we've been working on return to office with them, and they've started to return their people kind of throughout July. Group C, which is the largest group, is anticipating coming back sometime between September and November, although that date kind of continues to get pushed back given what's been going on recently. Group D is our 2021 folks. You know, a lot of that is also getting pushed back. So I think everyone probably saw on the news, Google has decided to keep people working from home until July of 2021. So they have a little bit more time to sort of see what happens. And then finally, probably the most conservative folks who are really focused on not going back until there's a vaccine or an FDA approved treatment. So some of our more risk averse clients or some of our pharma clients are sort of looking at that way. So the folks who have epidemiologists, virologists on staff are a little bit less likely to be going back anytime soon. I think the other thing to note is that what we've learned over the past 5 months now, 4 months, is changing. So initially, when we started this conversation, you know, we were really looking at, you know, surfaces. How do we reduce contamination of surfaces? So people were talking about different materials we could use, increasing cleaning, how to go touch-free. And now the more we learn about the virus, the more how our return to work strategies are changing. So there's more focus on what we call IAQ, which is indoor air quality. So how do you ensure that you have the right mechanical systems, or that you've de-densified enough so that you can maintain a high IAQ quality within the space, and less focus on the concern about spreading pathogens on surfaces, because what we're learning from the CDC and other organizations is that that's typically not how diseases spread. The other thing that we've been working a lot about is this notion of trust. The companies that we're working with really is they're thinking about how to instill this culture of trust, because going back to work is an act of trust, both on the employee side and on the employer side. So as an employer, I trust that you're wearing a mask when you're at home, that you're not going to large gatherings, that you're staying away from folks who have COVID, or that you're coming forward when you do test positive. And as an employee, I want to make sure that my employer is doing everything that they can do to make sure the workplace is a safe place. When we asked, we've been doing a lot of polling, as you guys probably can tell by now, but when we asked about what the biggest concerns were with regard to returning to work, 75% of those surveyed said the biggest concern was a coworker coming in sick, or even as an asymptomatic carrier. So that's something that we're really spending a lot of time with our clients discussing, and making sure that we're having the right conversations with them about that. And then there's a ton of little tactical things that need to happen before we actually bring people back into the workplace, which I'll get into in a little bit more detail in a moment. So before we're arriving back at the office, a lot of our clients are thinking about or have implemented seat reservation systems, not only because they need to have a better understanding of the capacity going forward. None of our clients are going back with 100% of people, as you probably can guess. So if the capacity of the office has been reduced to 25%, you've obviously got to book something to be in the office, but also as a way to do contact tracing. So in the event that someone does get sick, we want to be able to make sure that we can do contact tracing after the fact. Cleaning protocols have changed. Obviously, they've increased pretty substantially. One of the most interesting things that has come out of this is the need for people to see their cleaners. So, we were working with a client increasing the amount of cleaning that was happening overnight, but no one could see it. And so, in a very strange sort of about face, we actually have cleaners coming during the day now, so that people can actually see their presence. They can know that they're there. And just from a psychology perspective, that's a really important thing for people. We're switching out a lot of food and beverage, so moving to grab and go. So for our clients who do provide food or have food for sale, moving to a system where you can grab a sandwich that's already been prepackaged rather than a buffet type system. And then we've also been spending a lot of time on signage and wayfinding, which I'll get to in a moment. Probably the biggest thing has been how to physically distance people in the workplace. There's a lot of different strategies for this. Some of the companies that we're working for have opted to just use every other desk or every third desk as a way to do it with minimal impact. But for others, actually reconfiguring the workplace to have a minimum of 7, 8, 9, 10 feet in some cases has been really critical. It's interesting for us because everyone is approaching this a little bit differently. We have clients who are 100% okay with the 6-foot physical distancing, and others who want to start off with a 10-foot and then move from there. And so that's been a big part of the work that we've been doing. And we've also been looking at mechanical upgrades. So how do we think about, without spending a ton of money, are there ways to change the mechanical system either by introducing UV germicidal actions or photocatalytic. So there's two sort of options that we've been exploring, piloting with clients with very different expenses, but seeing what the actual impact could be for those. And then signage, we've got a pretty big graphics and wayfinding department at this point. And so we've been leveraging them to sort of create content for return to the office. And in some cases, this is permanent signage that's going to be there for the rest of the building's life. When you're thinking about things like, washing your hands or cleaning up your dishes, those are good messages all year round, whether there's a pandemic or not. And then there's other things that are a little bit more temporary that we're building out as well. I did want to spend 2 seconds on the image in the corner. In the bottom right, this was something that we did for a fashion company, and we just created the graphics, and they actually created these signs themselves at home because they had a really tight timeline, and they needed to do the install pretty quickly. And so in a lot of cases, the work that we're doing is super scrappy, get it done, because there's a real drive there from our clients. So that's just a really broad look at what we're seeing with regard to return to office. Again, everyone's doing it a little bit differently because everyone's at a different stage. Thank you, Mimi, for the comment. But I think what it is helping us to understand is how the workplace is going to evolve in the future. And that's really where we've been spending a lot of time with certain clients who are ready to start actually talking about what the next phase of their workplace is going to be. So one of the things that we've been exploring with clients is how they look at their real estate portfolio today, especially for larger organizations. How that is managed is really critical. So a lot of the companies that we've worked with in the past have really focused on making sure that you have this sort of hub system with maybe some remote employees. And the idea here is that you get everyone under one roof. So there's great efficiencies in terms of operational costs, in terms of real estate costs, and ultimately having everyone under one roof is really seen as a way to sort of promote cross collaboration and things like that. With the pandemic, that is sort of starting to evolve. So does it make sense to have companies more aligned to a hub and spoke model where you have maybe a larger hub with several smaller offices in different regions, or even within the same region, to provide better resiliency? And what I mean by that is, if one office goes down because of a pandemic or some sort of virus outbreak, and putting COVID aside for a moment, we deal with this every year with the flu season on a different scale. But there's a way to sort of think about, making sure that you're building a portfolio that's resilient. So having these sort of small satellites, both to reach new markets or to better reach talent, is something that we've been working with some clients, and they've actually started to go down a new route and rethinking how they are using their portfolio. And then there's the idea of a networked office where you have smaller sites across a region. And maybe those sites can be supplemented with places like co-working spaces or cafes, things like that, once they open up again, that don't necessarily have to be full-time office spaces, but they could be used as sort of third places to support your existing portfolio. And those are it's a little bit more complex, obviously. There's less efficiency in terms of the floor plate, but again, it's really about flexibility, resiliency, getting people to getting better access to talent, to new markets in a system like this.
And that starts to plug into the notion of the kind of community scale mixed use concept, where you could be working closer to where you live, assuming you have the kind of co-workability, adjacent to where you live.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I especially in sort of larger urban areas where you can make your office as safe as possible for your employees, but if your employees can't get to the office because they don't feel comfortable taking public transit, or because of nasty traffic or what have you, it doesn't matter what you initiate for your return to office work. It will ultimately depend on those other pinch points. So I want to talk a little bit about numbers, and some of you may see this slide and your eyes are going to glaze over. So bear with me. I'm really passionate about this stuff, and we tend to kind of geek out about this a lot. But this is something that I think is really interesting and important. So if you're not interested in math right now, this is a good time to maybe go grab a cup of coffee. So what we're starting to look at with a lot of our clients is moving to a more mobile model. And we have a lot of clients who traditionally they never would have considered what we would call agility or unassigned seating or mobility or seat sharing, whatever you want to call it. But having gone through the pandemic, or having been in the pandemic, they're realizing that people are working just fine from across locations. So there's this, we sort of climbed this hill, and suddenly there's a big realization that our offices are all empty. Is this the best way for us to spend our real estate? So what we started to do with clients is explore mobility in a much more aggressive way than we've done in the past. So this is an example, a typical workplace, and this is based on our benchmark data. If you had about 400 people with 400 seats, roughly 175 USF per seat, that's the density. And then you've got, everyone is assigned, everyone gets their own desk. You've got a mix of meeting spaces. So let's say there's 12 meeting seats for every 16 people, just to give you a sense of what that means. And then there's a good amount of amenities as well. And when we say amenities, we're talking about, the gyms, the cafes, all of those things that are above and beyond what you need for the workplace. So if you built out your space in a way like that, it's going to take about 70,000 square feet, which is no small number. Looking at it with a little bit of mobility, where you've got 80% of people who have their own desk, and then the other 20% are working from that cafe I mentioned, or they're working from home some days. They're a little bit more mobile, they're a little bit more fluid. You've got to increase your collaboration ratio. You'll typically need more meeting spaces. We would typically beef up your amenity spaces as well, because we want to have those overflow places for people to sit. But it does start trimming down the amount of square footage you need. And you can take that even further. In this case, 60% of people are unassigned. So they're either working remotely or at one of those sort of third places. Only 40% of people have workstations. And again, you're increasing the amount of meeting rooms you have, you're increasing the amount of amenities, but you do start driving down that real estate requirement. And that's a big number for a lot of companies. When you think about a lease over 15 years, that could be a really significant savings. So this is something that we've been exploring. You can do this in a lot of different ways, either through interviews or utilization studies, but usually it's a big conversation with leaders, because this isn't right for everyone. But in going through the pandemic, I think a lot of people have realized that they can be much more mobile than they have been in the past. What does that actually mean, though, in terms of cost? Apologies, these are more New York-y numbers, but if you're building at a 70,000 square foot space at $130 a square foot, we're talking about $9 million or so. It's the typical workplace. If you did that at the same amount, at the same cost per square foot, you're getting to about $5 million. But in some cases, as you're building more collaboration spaces, as you're building more amenity spaces, it actually increases the cost per square foot. You're building a different type of space and it's going to cost more money. So you may actually end up almost at the exact same number, depending on the type of space you're building up. So I think, the initial spend could be really high, but overall there's a savings across the years, given that you're taking so much less square footage. So that's the end of the math. So for those of you who did not like that, you can start paying attention again. But what this really begs the question, the question that this really begs is what does the workplace look like now? So if you have more people who can work from home, who are staying home when they don't need to be collaborating, what is the actual workplace for? And really what we're talking about is this place for high value interaction. So when you're coming into the office, you're doing more cross-functional meetings. So you're meeting with different types of groups, you're doing kickoffs, you're doing client-facing events that are really difficult to do or could be difficult to do virtually. And any sort of large-scale meeting environments or workshop activities, which really, Zoom is an amazing platform, but it's not necessarily the same as doing what people are doing in the image and the right. So that's really what we've been talking to our clients about in terms of what the space looks like in the future. And then what we're also thinking about is what is going to really draw people to the office. In this new paradigm where I could work from home most days if I choose, I could go to a co-working space. What's going to bring me to the office? So we actually did a survey of end users to find out what are the most valuable amenities to have in their building. Number one, which is I think a little bit surprising, but maybe not so surprising after COVID, is rooftop space, outdoor space. So having your own outdoor space, like the one in the image that you see here on the right, which is Google's New York headquarters, becomes really attractive. Coffee shop, grab and go food, still, those have always been really popular. Less popular, probably no surprise here either, fitness spaces, yoga spaces, and I think that has a lot to do with the pandemic that we're seeing right now. I want to pause for a second. I saw a question pop up. Have you studied management desires for employee desires to have collaboration in the office and not from home? I think that's a great question. There's a few different things. So a lot of this is going to be up to the managers. So Stuart, I think you're onto something there. This has been a really interesting sort of pilot though, because a lot of managers have sort of understood that like the collaboration that we do at home is fine. It may not be ideal, but it's working okay. There are other organizations that we're working with, law firms, for example, where the mentorship and the sort of collaboration between a first or a second year associate and a partner, so that relationship is really critical, and they really want that to continue to happen in person. So there's a real desire to continue to have that sort of mentorship happen on a day-to-day basis in the office rather than virtually, which is why we still need to create space for, smaller collaboration within the office. And the other thing that we've been talking a lot about is this idea of remote equity. So once everyone gets back into the office, once most people get back into the office, there will predictably be a lot of people still working from home. So it would be very unusual if suddenly 100% of the workplace was back at the office. And so what we want to think about doing is either through training, through technology, through space, how do we build a more immersive experience for people, so that the people who are on the other end of the line, the people who are not in the office, who are connected virtually, still feel like they're part of a meeting, feel like they're collaborating. Remote employees are 50% less likely to get promoted. So we really want to make sure that they are really integrated into the culture of the firm where they work. And finally, how can you leverage co-working spaces to build a more flexible portfolio? So I think everyone is familiar with what happened to WeWork over the past year, but I think we're still pretty bullish on the future of co-working as a way to provide more flexibility for organizations, whether that's through increased networking, learning from other organizations, the idea of being able to have events for collaboration or ceremony, so that you're not building that space within your own office, but you're using an external space instead. Having the ability to have business services, like all of the concierge type things, rather having that outsourced seems to be like a really attractive thing for a lot of our clients. And then overflow, there's a lot more there's a lot less predictability in terms of worker schedules. And so having a co-working space or having co-working memberships for your team is a great way to think about providing more flexibility in the future.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I'm going to move through this higher ed material kind of quickly. I'm watching the clock, and I see we've got about 15 minutes, and we do want to leave some time for some questions. Hey, look, it's another corridor. This is a corridor with a history. And I know I dwell on corridors, I mentioned them earlier on the Google project, but these really are important spaces. This corridor's history is that it was a building built by the Department of Design and Construction in New York City, and it looked like a lot of high school and college corridors that a lot of you might remember. Concrete block construction, maybe some lockers running down, lining that space. It's not really a corridor anymore. It still functions as one, obviously, but this is really the cross-functional meetup space of workplace translated into educational space. These are spaces that are thriving and living with thoughts and sharing of ideas, and we all know that those kinds of impromptu conversations often lead to some of the best ideas and some of the best learning experiences as well. Moving on, I mentioned we were a research-based organization. We surveyed at the very beginning of COVID, or within a month or so of the beginning of COVID, we surveyed 1,000 college and university students nationwide. The results were a little surprising in that a large percentage of them were actually ready to go back. But there were certain conditions under which they were ready to go back, and that wasn't surprising, right? This was being clean and sanitary environments, all of the same stuff that we're seeing in workplace, that you don't necessarily imagine younger generations being as concerned about, but here they were very concerned about it. So it was about testing, it was about remaining healthy, it was about masks and gloves, and it was about distance learning. Students were more open to distance learning, in this situation than they might have been in the past. I think what we really need to keep in mind for students, as we need to keep it in mind for members of our teams in the workplace, is really the kind of cultural side of all of this and the social side of all of this. As we've changed and as we've evolved over a 5-month period, day in, day out, not necessarily being in the presence of our peers, we experience a bit of a slippage. Each day is a little bit more of a slippage. We have to work harder to make sure that we're engaging one another in the right ways. We have to encourage our peers to turn their cameras on and be more present, or be as present as they can be within the confines of the technology that we're using. What we need to do for students is similar. If this was a traditional classroom and the traditional kind of density of a classroom, if what comes in the next slide, if what comes next is a de-densification of these desks, we need to really start to think about what else we can do for them in order to provide them the kind of co-ed experience. And I don't mean the parties, although that's fun. I mean the co-ed experience. I mean the experience of being a student at that particular school, because you're not necessarily going to get that experience if you're cooped up in your parents' basement. We need to try and help them evolve, and it may take time, into a kind of landscape of planning that includes other kinds of spaces. So what you see kind of lined outside of these classroom spaces are pods, and these are the kind of pods that we've seen for a long time in workplace, whether they're telephone booths or booths that can support a couple of people at the same time. But it's a changing of scale, right? It's about de-densifying the classroom and re-densifying and reanimating some of the other spaces on campus in order to provide you know, in order to spread out, you know, the environment more. Take some of the spaces that aren't going to be as utilized. We don't see in the immediate return to campus kind of lifestyle much in the way of food service on the larger scale. The students are going to be encouraged to be eating, you know, alone, or maybe some of the prepackaged food that Matt was mentioning that we're going to see in workplace. We're going to see that moving into the educational world as well. But the large cafeteria is probably a space that's primed to be temporarily used as other kinds of learning spaces at various scales. So we're thinking about that as a kind of the cultural, you know, side of gluing the student body together, even when they're physically being pulled apart. And we're thinking about the various ingredients within the classroom that are going to be necessary. And again, a lot of these things become quite parallel to things that we're doing in the workplace, whether it's, you know, whether it's changing or automating door controls, you know, providing hand sanitizer in all of these spaces. Bookable technology, right? I mean, if we're not using bookable technology already in the workplace, we should be. A lot of universities aren't using bookable technology for their classrooms, and they certainly should be as well. This is an opportunity to increase the utilization of spaces, both within the office and within the school. So it's something that is a long-term investment for sure, but a short-term solution to helping spread out that population. Cameras, you know, goes without saying. And then we're looking at other spaces on the campus as well. The other learning opportunity spaces. In this case, we were sketching a library, but we could just as easily have been looking at a cafeteria or other large group space, which is going to be less utilized as we work our way out of the COVID situation, and possibly more utilized, you know, in a better way. There's a lot of data that shows that the kind of conversation that we're talking about in the corridor is the source of, you know, thriving thoughts and, you know, a stronger ability to learn. And by the way, I'm not really just, if you see where I'm headed with this, I'm not really just talking about educational spaces anymore. I'm really talking about space in general. We learn better from one another when we talk, when we discuss, period. Students can adapt that, you know, and use that better. Some students that are brought up that way might just start to form study groups of their own early on in their education. Students that work in groups do better. It's just a statistical fact. So if we can adopt that mentality of study groups, even in undergraduate programs, where those of you that went to law school know that was something that was just assigned on day one, if that was something that we adopted on day one in undergraduate programs, we start to break down the community. We start to take what was a school or college or classroom and turn it into a smaller group, maybe a family, maybe we'll throw on the kind of tacky quarantine term that's become quite popular now, right? 4 to 6 students that work together. Maybe one of them is a delegate to go to a particular live class and comes back to the others and shares notes at the end of the day. That's one way of doing it. Or in the case of this diagram, maybe we're starting to break down other spaces that may or may not have some sort of a physical barrier between them, but spaces where students can now book, to share, to take a remote course together, right? These things work better, just like this one. You know, a Zoom call works better where you experience it with somebody else and not necessarily just alone. So those kind of group interactive sessions become more powerful tools for, you know, within the learning community and within the remote community. As Matt said, we're not all going to go back to the office at the same time. We'll be back in the office in you know, in various waves. But I think we're going to start to realize very quickly that the glue starts to form, even if it's just 2 or 3 of us in a conference room together and everybody else is remote. It's going to start to, you know, we're going to have our, you know, co-ed experience as well.
Oh, sorry, Bennett. Yeah,
this is an interesting project. This is for Google. It's called Code Next. It's interesting. Period, on many levels, as a maker space that is within a Google property in New York City. It happens to be on the streetscape. It was a retail space. But it's really interesting, and of the time where we start to think about the engagement of enterprise with, within the context of big picture mixed use, and within the context of where's education going, right? The reason I feel it's important for us to drop these notions even within the context of a workplace discussion is that as we look at what's happening in education, and we look at where the demographics of education are going to go, quite practically, many universities are going to have more space than they can actually use, right? There'll continue to be the universities that are on the medical side, on the healthcare side, in certain niche, sectors that are going to continue to just thrive. Their enrollment isn't going to change. Many other universities are going to see an enrollment drop over the course of the next 3 or 4 years. And they're going to be looking for other ways to use their space. Well, guess what? Entrepreneurialism is one of the most growth-driven parts of our society right now. Less and less people are heading into the corporate world, and more people are, I'm going to drop a word here, accelerating into entrepreneurialism, right? That's what's going to happen next. So if we look towards places within the real estate community to put enterprise, community, and education together, these are ingredients for great success. And that's what the Google Code Next project really is all about. And this slide, finally, is something else that was a COVID-driven sort of piece of thought that it starts to think about retail spaces. In New York, the image on the upper left, and in cities around the country, we're looking at boarded up retail. And it's not necessarily just due to some of what's been going on in society lately. It's also because the demise of retail is a real thing. There's a reason why, Amazon's numbers went up and net worth went up by $10 billion or something last week. We're all at home, right? So retail is unfortunately, changing, and that real estate needs to start to adapt. Hopefully we'll see a lot of our retailers come back. Hopefully we'll see a lot of our restaurants come back, but there will be opportunities there. And we think those opportunities are going to be other opportunities for the linkage to community, for enterprise, for academia, and for entrepreneurialism. We think that there is, there's a change coming. And as we look at, on the greater scale, the mixed use ability of community, where we want to and need to surround ourselves with, that variety of other experiences, that this is one of those experiences that could really help. And I haven't really defined what it is. I've been pretty careful about what I just said, because I have not defined this. But we know in urban areas that we are seeing sidewalks now being used, more and more for restaurants, as we need to spread out quite physically. But NYU in New York City is starting to think about outdoor learning spaces. And there are other ways that I think through, again, the kind of enterprise academia, relationships within communities, we can build better bonds through real estate. Matt, you just disappeared. There you are. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to open it up for questions. We had some information here that we can share with you about, what working from home we need to think about, because as Bennett mentioned, we're still going to be working from home in the future. But I did want to open it up for questions. There was one here from Mimi, which I think is a really good one to share. The first was about, what does this mean for offices? Are we going to go back to offices going forward? Because the open office is dead. That's where germs get spread. And I think it's a really interesting point. One of the challenges with offices and with managers in general, typically offices are used for a lot of one-on-one, two-person conversations. But if you have an office with a closed door, that is exactly the type of environment where aerosols and droplets can thrive. There's no circulation. It's in an enclosed space, and so ultimately, that's not an ideal place in terms of pathogen spread. So I think, we'll really need to think hard about, what are those offices being used for? If someone wants to work independently with, with no distractions and great acoustics, like maybe that means working from home in the future, with, just forgetting the dogs and the kids for a moment. And really they're only going into the workplace to collaborate. And so do you need offices in that regard going forward? But there is a lot of concern about pathogens, droplets and aerosols getting contained in an office without any sort of circulation of air. There's another question about predictions on how much vacancies there will be in commercial real estate after COVID. And I cannot Bennett, do you have a prediction on vacancies in commercial real estate?
I don't have any stats on that right now, Matt. I think it remains a bit of a moving target. I think there are too many unknowns right now to kind of speculate on it.
I think it's something to think about. And it really depends on the market. I know in New York, we had been experiencing some vacancy, especially in certain areas where it was sort of being exacerbated. But prior to COVID, the work of Amazon and digital shopping, that was generally not exaggerated, but I think people had a sense that 40% of shopping was being done online, and it's nowhere near that. After this, it may be, but prior to the pandemic, it was closer to 4%. Very, very low number. That's not to say that it's not rising really quickly, and that's going to have a big impact on retail space anyway. But it's really hard to kind of predict going forward. For smaller companies, they're looking for 5,000 square feet or less. What is the best office concept for space? It depends on the company. It's not a great answer, but if you want something highly customized, highly branded, then I would probably say that you're going to want to actually lease your own space and sort of go with that. But there are all sorts of different co-working companies where if you're less concerned about sort of maintaining a really distinct brand or a distinct image, where you could get a no-tell. WeWork at that scale probably doesn't make much sense, but no-tell tends to work at that larger scale. And those are just the big name ones. There's also tons of different smaller scale co-working spaces. We have what we call a Studio Go, which is a small scale office in Stamford, Connecticut, where we're doing a lot of large projects right now. That's in an old sort of print house thing, and that's probably about 5,000 square feet. But again, these independent purveyors of co-working spaces may be a great place if you're less concerned about your ability to control your brand, your image, the design of the space. Any other questions? I'm not seeing anything coming up in the chat. I know we went over a sincere apologies.
No, that was great. Thank you so much, Matt and Bennett. And as you can see, everyone, they've left their information there on the screen. Just so everyone knows, we will make this presentation available. We've shared this on our Facebook page. We were live the whole time, and we'll also follow up with an e-blast and a newsletter, and everyone will receive a follow-up of this presentation. Huge thank you to both Matt and Bennett. This was a very intellectual and intelligent conversation about the workplace, and I think a lot of people haven't even thought about the science and the research behind what the office space could look like in the future. So thank you guys for this, and I would love to see another one of these presentations 5 or 6 months down the road as more and more has come to light. We've seen how much things change in the last 4 or 5 months. And so we would love to have you back and talk more about that in the future. So huge thank you to both Matt and Bennett for their time with this session and workshop today. Big thank you to our participants and those that participated in the poll and asked questions and listened and learned. And of course, our awesome sponsors, Wright Lindsay Jennings, Frost, and the Little Rock Regional Chamber. The Venture Center is committed to providing free programs, all on the focus of entrepreneurship, workspace, and workforce development. So we have several other programs in the works, specifically in August, one including the kickoff of our FIS FinTech Accelerator. That's on August 5th, so we encourage everybody to register for that. I also encourage you to check out our Facebook page, our website, sign up for our newsletter, keep in touch. Otherwise, everyone have a fantastic Friday. Enjoy your weekend, and we hope to see you again soon.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Stay healthy.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Bennett.
Thank you, Mimi.
Bye.
Thanks, Ashley. Bye now.
Yeah. Bye.